My name is Olivia Bennett. I am 29 years old from Austin, Texas. Have you ever had the two people who raised you try to humble you on the happiest day of your life? What would you do if your own parents boycotted your wedding, not because they were sick, not because they couldn't travel, but because they said you needed to be taught a lesson? And what if I told you they weren't just skipping the ceremony? What if they were hiding something so big, so hypocritical that my husband stood up at the reception and exposed it in front of everyone? Would you forgive them of the sadvert everything down? Stay with me, because this night changed everything. Let me tell you something. When my parents said they were trying to teach me humility, it sounded almost holy, almost wise. They said it softly, calmly, like mentors. But humility wasn't what they wanted. Control was. You see, growing up in Austin, my parents ran our house like a boardroom. Every decision had to be approved. Every choice had to align with the family vision. They didn't call it control. They called it guidance. They didn't call it pressure. They called it protection. And for a long time, I believe them. When I got my first corporate job, they insisted on reviewing my offer letter. When I signed my first lease, they asked why I didn't consult them first. When I started investing, they wanted access to my financial planner. At first, it felt normal, responsible, respectful. But then something shifted. The day I bought my condo without asking for their opinion, that's when the tone changed. Suddenly, I was impulsive. Suddenly, I was too independent. Suddenly, I was forgetting who helped me get here. And when I met Daniel, the man who would become my husband, it escalated. Daniel didn't come from wealth. He didn't need approval. He didn't need approval. He didn't ask permission to exist. He was confident, steady, and financially secure in his own right. And most importantly, he didn't treat my parents like authority figures. He treated them like equals. That was the problem. My parents were used to being admired, deferred to, consulted. But Daniel didn't orbit them. He orbited me. When we got engaged, instead of congratulations, I got a lecture. You're moving too fast. Marriage is serious. You're letting success get to your head. You need to stay grounded. Grounded? I was 29 years old, debt-free, promoted twice in 5 years, managing my own investments, building a life I worked hard for. But in their eyes, my independence looked like arrogance. The final blow came when I declined their offer to contribute significantly to the wedding with conditions attached, of course. Guest list control, vendor approvals, a speech they pre-wrote for my father, even suggestions about a prenuptial agreement that heavily favored family protection. When I said no, politely, calmly, that's when they decided I needed a lesson. If you think you're so grown, my mother said, maybe you should experience what life feels like without us cushioning it. Translation, if I didn't bend, they would withdraw. They assumed I would panic, that I would chase their approval, that I would shrink to keep the peace. But something inside me had changed. Years of subtle manipulation had finally become visible. I started seeing the pattern, the guilt disguised as love, the financial strings tied to every gift, the emotional pressure masked as parental concern. This wasn't about my marriage. It was about the fact that I no longer needed them to validate my decisions. They called it humility, but humility doesn't require humiliation, and love doesn't disappear when control does. The moment they boycotted my wedding, they thought they were proving I couldn't thrive without them. What they didn't realize, I had already built a life where their approval wasn't the foundation anymore. And that was the real threat. Let me ask you something. Have you ever received a message so calm, so polished that you almost missed how cruel it really was? 3 days before my wedding, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. not even a voicemail. Just worked. Such a perfectly crafted text message from my mother. If you go through with this without our blessing, don't expect us to show up. We refuse to support decisions that disrespect this family. No yelling, no insults, just quiet withdrawal. And somehow that hurt more. They didn't argue with me. They didn't beg me to reconsider. They didn't try to meet Daniel halfway. They simply decided to disappear. And here's what made it worse. They didn't tell anyone directly. They let the silence speak for them. Relatives started calling. Are your parents okay? Is everything all right? Your mom said there's been tension. Tension. That word floated around like perfume, subtle, polite, but heavy. This was strategic. They wanted people to notice their absence. They wanted whispers in the pews. They wanted my walk down the aisle to feel incomplete. They assumed that without them in the front row, I'd feel small. What they didn't understand is that embarrassment only works when you agree to carry it. The night before the wedding, I sat in my condo staring at that message again. I thought about calling them, apologizing just enough to secure their attendance, compromising just enough to make it look peaceful. But then I asked myself something important. Was I apologizing because I was wrong or because I was scared of being judged? And that's when it hit me. Their absence was supposed to be my shame. Instead, it became their statement. Wedding day came fast. The venue was glowing. White roses everywhere. Soft golden lights. Music humming through the air. Guests filling the chairs. But that front row, 2 empty seats. People noticed, of course they did, but something interesting happened. No one mocked me. No one whispered loudly. No one treated me like a rejected daughter. Instead, friends squeezed my hands tighter. My bridesmaids stood closer. Daniel's parents embraced me like I had always been theirs. The narrative my parents expected to control slipped right out of their hands. But here's where it really shifted. Because while they stayed home, silent and principled, my husband was watching the ripple effect, watching how carefully they were shaping the story behind the scenes. He saw the social media posts, vague quotes about children who forget their roots. He heard from a mutual contact that my father had mentioned disrespect at a business dinner. He noticed how they framed themselves as the wounded party. They thought staying away would make them look strong. Instead, it made them look suspicious. See, a boycott works best when the target collapses. I walked down that aisle smiling, not fake smiling, not revenge smiling, just free. Because something powerful happens when someone withdraws love as a weapon and you refuse to chase it. You see the truth clearly. They believed their absence would humble me, but what it actually did was expose how conditional their support had always been. And the moment their silence became public, that's when Daniel quietly said to me, if they want to make this about accountability, we should make sure everyone understands what that word really means. That's when I knew this wasn't over. Now, let me tell you where this story stops being emotional and starts becoming strategic. Because while my parents were busy protecting their image, Daniel was quietly analyzing it. You see, my parents built their entire identity around being self-made. At church events, business conferences, family reunions, they were the example, the disciplined couple, the ethical entrepreneurs, the mentors who lectured younger professionals about integrity, accountability, and doing things the right way. That word, again, accountability, is hardwired to just work. Accountability. They loved it, but Daniel, he works in corporate compliance. And when you marry someone in compliance, you learn something very quickly. They don't just listen to what people say. They follow the paper trail. It started innocently. A distant relative congratulated us and made an odd comment. Glad to see you're building something honestly. The way he said it lingered. Daniel asked a few gentle questions over the next few weeks. Nothing aggressive, just curiosity disguised as small talk. And that's when small inconsistencies began surfacing. A Start Act loan, my parents always described as fully repaid, apparently still outstanding. A business expansion they claimed was self-funded, partially financed by family money that was never formally documented. Then came the bigger discovery. One evening, Daniel was reviewing public business filings, something he does casually the way other people scroll social media. He noticed discrepancies between reported profits and declared tax summaries, dates that didn't quite match. Transactions labeled vaguely as consulting redistribution. Nothing dramatic enough for sirens, but enough to raise eyebrows. Now, let me be clear. We weren't hunting them. We weren't plotting revenge. But when someone publicly questions your integrity, you start examining theirs. Daniel didn't jump to conclusions. He cross-checked verifilings across years, looked at property acquisitions against reported income brackets, and then he found it. A property investment purchased under a secondary holding name, funded during a year, their company reported financial strain. The same year, they claimed they couldn't assist a struggling relative who later lost his home. That relative, the one who had originally loaned them startup capital, suddenly the story shifted. The moral lectures, the humility speeches, the public disappointment in me, it all felt different because the same people accusing me of arrogance were quietly protecting assets through shell structures and undocumented transfers. Daniel showed me everything one night at our kitchen table. Spreadsheets open, documents highlighted, notes organized. He didn't look angry. He looked precise. And then he said something I will never forget. They built authority on reputation. If they're willing to damage yours publicly, you have every right to defend yourself with facts. Facts, not gossip, not emotion, not revenge, theatrics, facts. The power dynamic shifted in that moment. For years, my parents controlled narratives through confidence and intimidation. They relied on the assumption that no one would question them deeply enough to verify. But here's what they didn't anticipate. They raised a daughter who married a man trained to audit inconsistencies. And the irony, the people preaching humility were the ones terrified of exposure. We didn't plan to humiliate them, but we refused to be quietly discredited, because once you see the gap between someone's public virtue and private behavior, you can't unsee it. And the more Daniel uncovered, the clearer it became. If they wanted to use my wedding as a stage for moral superiority, they had no idea how fragile their own spotlight really was. Now let me set the scene for you. The ceremony was beautiful, peaceful, almost sacred. I said my vows. Daniel said his. People cried. People clapped, but there was still an invisible tension floating in the room. 2 empty chairs in the front row, 2 names missing from the program acknowledgments. 2 shadows where my parents should have been. By the time the reception started, the music was louder, the lights were warmer, and champagne had softened the edges of the silence. But Daniel, he was watching, not nervously, not angrily. He had seen the passive-aggressive social media posts. That morning, he had heard from a guest that my father told someone, sometimes absence teaches stronger lessons than presence. lessons. That word again, halfway through dinner, the DJ tapped the mic and announced open toasts. A few friends spoke. Daniel's father gave a heartfelt welcome. Laughter rolled across the room. And then Daniel stood up. He wasn't scheduled to speak again. We had already done our thank you speech. But when H.E. reached for the microphone, something in the air shifted. He didn't look at me first. He scanned the room. Before we closed tonight, he began, voice steady. I just want to say something about accountability. You could hear forks gently set down on plates. He smiled slightly. We're grateful for everyone who chose to show up for us today, because showing up is easy when things are perfect. It's harder when you don't agree. And it's even harder when your pride is louder than your love. The room went still. He didn't mention my parents' names. Not once. That's why, he continued, we believe accountability should apply to all of us equally in marriage, in business, in family. There it was, business. A few guests exchanged glances. Some of them knew my parents professionally. Some had heard whispers already. Daniel didn't accuse. He didn't rant. He simply added, if you're going to publicly question someone's integrity, you should be very certain your own record can withstand the same level of review. No raised voice, no dramatic pause, just precision. And then the final line, we wish everyone peace, and we hope that anyone who believes in humility also believes in transparency. Mic down. That was it. No spreadsheets projected on walls. No documents passed around. No ugly spectacle. Just a message sharp enough to land exactly where it needed to, but it felt like 30. Then someone started clapping, then another. And then the room filled with applause, not chaotic, not shocked, but supportive. Because here's the thing, when you speak calmly, confidently, and without bitterness, people lean in. Daniel didn't humiliate my parents. He exposed the imbalance. The narrative flipped instantly. Instead of guests whispering about why my parents weren't there, they were quietly wondering why people who preach accountability would avoid a moment built on commitment and honesty. Phones buzzed that night. Conversations started, questions formed. And the most powerful part Daniel never said a single detail publicly. He didn't need to. In corporate environments, reputation isn't destroyed by shouting. It's destabilized by suggestion, especially when the person making the suggestion is known for precision and integrity. My parents tried to teach me humility by staying home. But in one controlled strategic speech, my husband reminded everyone that integrity isn't about who attends a wedding. It's about whether your private actions match your public standards. And that night, their silence became louder than any accusation ever could have been. You know what's louder than a public speech? The quiet that follows it. The morning after my wedding, I woke up not to peace, but to notifications, missed calls, text messages, emails, not dramatic threats, not explosive confrontations, questions. Is everything okay with your parents? Were those comments directed at someone specific? I heard there might be some financial confusion. Is that true? Confusion. That's how reputations start to tremble, not with scandal, with doubt. By noon, Daniel's phone was buzzing too. A business associate of my father casually asked him about corporate compliance standards. Another guest mentioned that my parents' recent property acquisition didn't quite align with their publicly shared hardship story from 2 years prior. And just like that, the narrative shifted. For years, my parents controlled rooms with confidence. They spoke with authority. They positioned themselves as mentors, examples, pillars of discipline. But authority built on perception is fragile, especially when someone calmly introduces the possibility that the perception, N may not match the paperwork. By the second day, my mother finally called. Her voice wasn't furious. It was strained. How could you let him say that? She asked. Even now, the language assumed control, assumed I was managed, directed. I answered calmly. I didn't let him say anything. He chose to speak. There was a pause. Then she said something telling. Do you realize what people are starting to ask? And that's when it hit me. They weren't upset about being hurt. They were upset about being questioned because questions lead to reviews. Reviews lead to audits. Audits lead to exposure. And exposure is uncomfortable when your image is carefully curated. Within a week, subtle consequences began unfolding. A potential investor requested additional documentation. A partnership renewal was temporarily paused. A community leadership panel quietly removed my father from an upcoming speaking slot. No accusations, just distance. That's how corporate environments protect themselves. They don't attack, they disengage. And suddenly, the same parents who tried to teach me humility were facing something they hadn't experienced in years, were uncertainty. Not because we destroyed them, but because we stopped protecting their illusion. Now, here's the part nobody expects. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter trying to earn approval. I wasn't the child negotiating for validation. I was a married woman standing beside a partner who believed in alignment between words and actions. My parents thought skipping my wedding would shrink me. Instead, it removed the final layer of fear I had about disappointing them. They wanted me humbled. But humility isn't about submission. It's about self-awareness. And what they learned slowly, painfully, is that love cannot be used as leverage forever. At some point, the person you're trying to control realizes they can survive without your approval. A few weeks later, my father sent a short message. We should talk, not a command, not a lecture, an invitation. Because when reputation wobbles, even the proudest people reconsider strategy. They tried to make my wedding about discipline, but it became a mirror. And in that mirror, the reflection wasn't of a rebellious daughter. It was of two parents realizing that the power they once held only existed because I allowed it. And the moment I stopped allowing it, they were the ones forced to confront humility. Now let me ask you something. How many of us stay silent just to keep the peace? How many of us accept disrespect because it comes wrapped in the word family? And how many times have you confused control with love? If this story hit you, if you've ever been pressured, manipulated, or publicly tested by the very people who were supposed to protect you, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button so this message reaches someone who needs the courage to stand up. Second, subscribe, because stories like this, they remind us that integrity always wins in the long run. And third, drop a comment below. Was Daniel right to speak up at the reception, or should we have stayed silent? I'm reading every single comment, because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't loud. It's living well, standing firm, and refusing to shrink. And trust me, this was just the beginning.